They made their own tools, spun cotton into fabrics for clothing, and built their houses from the resources around them. Food was plentiful from the farms, and the river was full of fish. In the heart of Nigeria, there was once a small town called Aja. It was a quiet and peaceful place, where the days passed slowly and the people lived simple lives as farmers and traders. The town was surrounded by vast forests and plains, and a long winding river ran along its eastern border. For generations, the people of Aja lived happily and largely kept to themselves. Their ancestors had founded the settlement over 200 years ago, building the first mud huts and clearing the land for crops. Since then, the population had grown to about 5,000 residents. They built a marketplace where people would barter handmade goods and the crops they grew on their farms. There was a central well where women washed clothes and collected water for their families. Elders would gather under the large baobab tree in the center of town to discuss matters and dispense advice. The people felt little need to venture far beyond the familiar confines of their home. At the edge of town stood a small school where the children would learn reading, writing, and mathematics. Most did not complete more than a few years of simple education before returning to work on their family's farm. There was also a small clinic run by the town's only doctor where people could receive basic medical treatment and medicines when they fell ill. The town was largely self-sufficient. They made their own tools, spun cotton into fabrics for clothing, and built their houses from the resources around them. Food was plentiful from the farms, and the river was full of fish. The forest provided firewood and herbs. Twice a year, they would hold a large market event that drew traders from villages many miles around. The people of Aja got to sample exotic wares and goods from far-off lands. It was an exciting time for the children. During the rest of the year, however, Aja remained in its isolated bubble. This uneventful way of life continued for Aja's residents without disruption for many generations. The years passed and older generations gave way to new ones, but little else changed. However, late one summer, trouble came to the forgotten town. It arrived with the next big biannual market. Merchants traveling to Aja brought news of unrest spreading across the region. A severe drought had struck the past farming season, leaving many villages' crops shriveled and their granaries empty. Bandits had risen up, attacking towns and stealing food. Rumors told of a massive camp of these raiders, set up just 50 miles from Aja's borders. The town elders dismissed these reports as exaggerated rumors. The people of Aja posted extra guards during the market weekend just to be safe, but did not believe their isolated home was in danger. After the merchants left, the residents quickly forgot the stories and went back to their normal lives. A month later, on an overcast afternoon, a sentry ran gasping into the market square, terrified. He said he had spotted a large group of armed men approaching the fields west of town. The people stared at him in disbelief. They had not seen a stranger in weeks, let alone an armed gang. Then the sound of screams and billowing smoke came from the western farmsteads. The raiders had arrived. They poured out of the forest, brandishing curved swords and torches, setting fire to the houses and granaries. Everyone panicked. Mothers grabbed their children and fled towards the center of town. Others ran to their homes to retrieve valuables and supplies. The raiders swept through the farms, destroying everything in their path. Within an hour, half the town was a smoldering ruin. A few men tried vainly to defend their families with hoes and hunting bows, but they were no match for the invaders' weapons. The raiders slaughtered all who resisted. Those who made it to the market square huddled in terror. Flames rose up from the western neighborhoods. Faint screams echoed from the outskirts. They could see the raiders rummaging through the remains of charred houses, looking for anything of value to loot. The elder counselors gathered in emergency session, but could think of no way to defend against an attack of this magnitude. The 200 town guards could not possibly hold off such a force. There was no time to send for help from other villages, even if it were available. For the first time in its 200-year history, Aja faced annihilation. The raiders soon turned their attention towards the eastern neighborhoods closer to the center of town. The people watched in despair as more homes went up in flames. The smoke was so thick it obscured the midday sun. In the eerie orange glow, it looked like the end of the world was coming. Unexpectedly, the steady patter of rain began to fall. Within minutes, a heavy downpour drenched the town. The smoke and fires quickly dissipated under the torrent. The raiders hesitated, uneasy with the sudden storm. Seizing the opportunity, the town elders beseeched the people to evacuate while they had the chance. Families scrambled to gather what provisions they could and fled north into the rainforest. In small groups to avoid attracting attention, the residents abandoned their beloved town and melting into the trees. By nightfall, almost the entire population had escaped into the bush, leaving Aja empty except for the occupying raiders. The former residents slowly made their way through the tangled forest, relying on their elders' knowledge of the land to find routes north to other villages where they hoped to find refuge. The journey took 3 arduous weeks, trudging through mud and rainstorms, evading wild animals and natural hazards in the untamed jungle. Along the way, many of the weaker members perished from exposure, animal attacks, or disease. By the time the survivors stumbled into Bayer, a village 50 miles north over the mountains, less than half of Aya's people remained. The residents of Bayer welcomed them with sympathy, but had little to offer the beggared refugees from the south. The drought had affected them badly too, leaving Bayer's granaries nearly empty. With so many more mouths to feed, the food would not last long. As the weeks passed, the refugees struggled to integrate into village life in Bayer. They labored on fishing crews and assisted in the rice paddies in exchange for scraps of food. But it was barely enough for the swollen population. Within 2 months, children began to fall ill from malnourishment, and disease took more lives. Meanwhile, Aja remained occupied by the raiders, who picked it clean of valuables, but left the buildings largely intact. They showed no indication of moving on. Aja was conveniently remote and well-stocked enough to sustain them. They enslaved the few residents who had not managed to escape, forcing them to work the fields under the threat of violence in order to provide food for the occupiers. The captured villagers whispered to each other in hope that someday their people might return to reclaim Aya. But as the first anniversary of the invasion passed, such hopes seemed increasingly unlikely. From their ramshackle refugee camp on Bayer's outskirts, the exiled residents of Aja stared south towards their lost home, praying for a miracle. The raiders settled into comfortable lives in Aja, claiming the nicer brick and thatched roof homes for themselves and turning the town square into their base. They continued to terrorize nearby settlements, but did not venture farther across the wilderness towards Bayer. As the next year dragged on, they paid little attention to the ruined southern neighborhoods they had originally sacked and burned. Life slowly returned to a dark version of normalcy under the raiders' regime. However, unknown to the occupiers, a small band of refugees had remained in Aja, surviving off fishing and wild plants in the dense swamps on the town's eastern border. This ragtag group of 30 plotted to rally their people and return to reclaim Aja. The hardy holdouts made the dangerous journey north through the rainforest to Bayer 6 months after the attack. The refugees at Bayer tearfully welcomed them, as if risen from the dead after so long without word of the fate of those who stayed behind. The party recounted the dire situation in Aja, but said the occupiers had grown lazy and complacent. They brought news of the captives working the fields under guard. A daring plan took shape. The refugees knew they were too few and weak to force the battle-hardened raiders out through open confrontation, but if they could avoid detection and get close enough to free the captive villagers, they believed combined they could retake Aja street by street in a stealthy midnight uprising. It was a risky strategy, but their only hope of regaining their home after 2 years of painful exile. Under the cover of darkness, small groups made their way south through little-used forest paths over subsequent months. All able-bodied adults who were willing to fight slipped away from Bayer over a period of weeks to avoid drawing attention. Only the elderly and very young remained behind, anxiously awaiting the outcome. On the night of the half-moon, when the occupiers recklessly celebrated a drunken festival, 200 shadowy figures emerged from the woods on the eastern outskirts of town. The refugees from Bayer linked up with the swamp dwellers and silently infiltrated the unfamiliar streets of their former home, weapons in hand. They stealthily cut the throats of raider sentries as they progressed block by block towards the town center. The occupiers had left the southeast quarter of town unguarded, allowing the liberation forces to move in undetected.